Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About It. This is Taylor Nolan, and I am your host. And today we're going to be chatting positive psychology. We're going to be chatting perfectionism and how to kind of get unstuck in our lives. So I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Sasha Heinz today, and I'll tell you a little bit about her before we jump into some of these topics. So she's a developmental psychologist and a life coach. She's an expert in positive psychology, lasting behavioral change, and the science of getting unstuck. She's leveraged her academic expertise as a former faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania's Master of Applied Positive Psychology program to help give her clients the tools to change their lives for good. And then she also has a private coaching practice that helps achievement junkies feel as good on the inside as their lives look on the outside, which I'm sure maybe sounds familiar to some of you listening. But Dr. Sasha Heinz is also a graduate of Harvard University and is a working mom. She's lived a life on the front line of the battle with perfectionism. So she's not only going to lend her knowledge and expertise, but also her own experience dealing with some of these things. So without any further ado, I'm really excited to get into this conversation and welcome Sasha to the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. And I'm really looking forward to not only hearing some of your knowledge and your expertise around positive psychology and perfectionism, but also, you know, the humanizing part of professionals of hearing your own personal story with perfectionism too.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. First, I'd figured just kind of start off with what got you into positive psychology in the first place and what kind of got you interested in wanting to go down that path and anyway.
Yeah. What got me in the first place? I mean, I think that like most people throughout adolescence and in their early 20s, like I just had, I felt really lost and sort of had a hard few years and was dealing with a lot. Looking back, I'm like, yeah, I was dealing with and coping with a lot of different things going on in my life. And I sort of, for someone who had been like pretty successful in achieving and worked hard and was able to sort of be successful in my efforts. I felt like all of a sudden, like the wheels had come off, I wasn't able, I sort of hit the skids, and all of a sudden it was like, wait, I'm not okay. Like I'm really starting to implode, as a person. So
how did you know that was happening?
I mean, I think, we all have different symptoms, but for me, my way of coping with things that felt very out of my control, was I had an eating disorder and which started out as restricting and then quickly morphed into bulimia, which became a total addiction. And so I was like, not just, in some way, like my mental health, in terms of sort of like my emotional health, like took the back seat to first and foremost trying to figure out and solve, like, how do I live functionally? How do I actually take care of myself with, and stop hurting myself? And that became sort of like the first task was like, how do I actually stop hurting myself? So, it really began this journey of beginning to understand what in the world does that mean? Like, what does it mean to take care of myself? What does it mean to be mentally healthy? What does it mean to heal emotional and psychological wounds and to live in a way that makes me feel good and, not just emotionally feel good, but physically feel good too. And so I sort of just became really interested, really interested in this work. And I think just because of perhaps my personality, and just, I think, I had always been an athlete as a child and as a teenager. I wasn't, really athletic, and I really resonated with this whole notion of like having a coach, being pushed, challenging oneself. And so the idea that it wasn't just like, hey, you're broken, you're psychologically broken. Here's your clinical diagnoses and we're going to get you back to like functional and we'll leave it at that. I mean, I think I really got excited about this idea that what if, this massive face plant, this like really hard time that I'm going through and all of the pain and just total despair. I mean, really honestly, like that's anyone in the throes of an addiction knows exactly what that feels like. Just total despair.
Yeah.
That it's never going to get better. And once I started to, heal some of these wounds and realizing like, oh my gosh, what if just functional isn't the end point? What if I can actually work on and develop and cultivate greater mental health and become more resilient and actually, what I went through actually make me stronger and actually becoming sort of more mentally and psychologically more robust. So that was for me really exciting. And I just loved this idea that I could challenge myself and grow and develop, to evolve and to sort of up level to a different version of myself. Like that really grabbed me, that idea.
Yeah. And when you talk about this process of starting to heal, I'm curious, was therapy a part of that for you?
Totally. Like I am a huge proponent of therapy. I mean, everyone should be so lucky to have a great therapist in their life to help them unpack, what their own experience and how that has shaped their thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Everybody has experienced some degree of trauma. It's just the human experience, right? So, and people respond to different situations differently, right? There's evidence that, that there are, kids have different temperaments. Some kids tend to be more of a dandelion. Like they can thrive in the crack of concrete, right? Like it doesn't matter. Their external environment isn't going to have such a big impact on them, perhaps psychologically. And then there are kids who are orchids, right? So they may be more sensitive temperamentally, which means that given the right environmental, context, they become the most rare and beautiful flower. They also are very sensitive to a harsh, environment, right? An environment that's not nurturing and taking care of them. Whereas like a dandelion, dandelions they're going to be great. They're going to do well despite, more difficult circumstances and like, and like a harsher environment. So I think it's important to recognize like which kind of, if you do have a more sensitive, perhaps you have a more sensitive temperament or anything, like you feel like there's wounds from your childhood or there's things that you're like, gosh, anytime you're in a situation where you're like, I don't understand. Like, I know I shouldn't do this, or I know I'm sabotaging myself, or I know that this just is making my life so much more difficult, this behavior that I keep doing, but I can't get myself to stop. Like, that's a really good place to pause and like, it's a good indicator. It's an indicator light.
Definitely.
It's like the indicator light in the car is blinking, right? That there is something that needs to be worked out, right? That you're not just banging your head against the wall on purpose.
Yeah.
That you're right.
Yeah, no. And I think this notion, that people cope and experience trauma and things in their lives very differently, I think is super important. I know that's something I've had to work with some of my clients on, of just like, experiencing an event or a situation and having a completely different reaction than other people had. And this sort of shame and guilt and blame that starts happening internally because, why is this so hard for me? And like other people are fine, but like this was really intense for me. And I love that. I love that image of like the dandelion and the orchid. I think being able to be self-aware and look internally to see kind of where you fit a little bit could be helpful, and having some grace and having some empathy for yourself when, life does throw shit at us.
Totally. I mean, I think that, right, when you think about it in that, which is exactly what happens, right? So people go through an experience and, let's just say like divorce. A lot of kids grow up with parents getting divorced. It's really a normal life experience these days. Some kids, given the circumstances of the situation, the way that the conflict in the house, like all sorts of there's tons of different variables, right?
Yeah.
and largely out of their control, like their genetic, the genes they were given, you know, the how their parents are handling their own relationship, like all these things that are totally out of the child's control. And some, you know, kids experience more, you know, psychological trauma than others in the same, and you have two children in the same family, two different siblings, and they'll have a totally different experience. Yeah. So it's like, you have to deal with first all those feelings that were probably unprocessed and unfinished, right? And then on top of it, dealing with the shame and embarrassment that you're not just moving on, right? That you're not just like, why is that person just can kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and move on with their life, and I'm still like, and I still seem to not be able to move past this. So, you know, you have to work on those, you know, both of those layers. But I mean, I think that for most people, like with mental health, it's the same thing with physical health, which is why I really love the coaching industry, because I think it's helped us like reframe mental health in a different way, which is to think like, there are doctors, everybody needs to go to their doctor. Everybody needs to go to an annual physical. Everybody needs to make sure that they are not sick. Right? But it is equally important to exercise, work out, go to a trainer, eat well, you know, have a good relationship with food, and have health, you know, making sure that you have healthy nutrition and a wide, you know, diverse nutrients, et cetera, right? That you're also taking care of your health beyond making sure that you're just not sick.
Totally.
Right. And I think it's the same as people are beginning to realize that the same is true with mental health, which is like, yes, we all have things that, you know, that make us sort of dysfunctional in certain areas of our life that we need to heal. Right. But that there's also like a strength-based approach, right, where we can become more resilient, stronger, and more psychologically fit as well.
Totally. I totally agree with that. All right, I want to take a short break right here, because I think for some of our listeners right now who are maybe listening to this episode might already be considering, you know, psychology is really cool and this seems to be helping me out, and, you know, maybe is therapy a good choice for me? And I've shared this wonderful sponsor of the podcast before, but I want to share it with all of you lovely listeners again, and that is BetterHelp, which is online counseling, and this is with licensed professional counselors. They specialize in basically almost any topic or issue that you are struggling with. Anything that you share is confidential. It's the same as if you were seeing a therapist in real life, just virtually. You can get help at your own pace, at your own time, and schedule secure video sessions or phone sessions, and also chat and text with your therapist. And one of my favorite parts about BetterHelp is that if you're not happy with your counselor for any reason, you can request a new one at any time with no additional charge, and also that they start communicating with you in under 24 hours. And best of all, it's truly an affordable option. And on top of that, they also offer financial aid, so it's incredibly affordable. And now I'm about to make it even more affordable for y'all. It is now going to be 10% off your first month for listeners of Let's Talk About It with the discount code Talk About It. So why not start today? Go to betterhelp.com/talkaboutit. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs, and then you'll get matched with a counselor you'll love in under 24 hours, and you'll start your therapy journey. So again, that's betterhelp.com/talkaboutit. And I hope you guys take advantage of this wonderful resource, and don't deprive yourself of the help that you might need or that you're curious about. Like, give it a shot. I hope it's helpful, and I hope y'all check it out. And with all that said, we can get back to the show. I want to go back a little bit to something you were talking about when we were talking about like the shame and the guilt and whatnot that goes into being able to say that, you know, something's wrong here. I'm really struggling with this. And often there's this pressure that we then feel to make it seem like we're totally okay, to make it seem like on the outside that everything's totally fine. Like internally, I'm a total shit show and I'm freaking out, but like, you know, I'm still going to be getting all A's. I'm still going to be, you know, all American athlete. I'm still going to be all of these things, even though on the inside, I'm falling apart completely. And I think that is kind of at a great description there of perfectionism, and where shame or perfectionism really actually helps set up things like shame and judgment and blame, which just leads to more of those things. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about kind of your experience with perfectionism.
Yeah. I mean, like, hello. Yes, I'm intimately acquainted with perfectionism. We have a very intimate relationship. No, but like really what perfectionism is so tricky, because I think on some level, like we still have this idea that it's like somehow morally good.
Yeah. We think perfect is good for some reason. We think perfect is,
oh my God, all squared away and, making it look all like perfect. And that's a good thing. Yes. Being emotionally squared away is an awesome thing. I highly recommend it. But, but having like wearing this kind of like this, having the sort of window dressing of it has to look all perfect. Otherwise otherwise I'm going to die, which is essentially what your brain is telling you. It is not optimal. Right. So, I mean, really what perfectionism is it's really just fear. It's fear plus shame equals a perfectionism. Right. So it's the fear of external judgment. Right. Yeah. It's like it's
all about trying to earn approval from other people.
Totally. Right. So people who identify as a perfectionist, like what they will find all over their life is their sort of yearning for external validation. Right. So wanting, praise and approbation from other sources externally. But really, why do we want other people to tell us that like we're doing a good job and that we're great and that we're lovable and like all of these things? We want to hear that from other people because we fundamentally don't give that to ourselves. Right. So when we feel shame about who we are, like shame that if they knew the real me, right? If they only knew what was going on under the hood, if they only knew what I was really like behind the scenes, like they wouldn't like me. They wouldn't love me. They wouldn't, they wouldn't approve of me. And so it's like when we believe that when we have those thoughts about ourselves, right? And then it's like, this is the perfect cocktail for perfectionism.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm wondering too, even earlier when you were sharing about when you were struggling with eating disorders and talking about how that's really addictive, and perfectionism is also very addictive and self-destructive. And I'm wondering if that's kind of where for you first started to notice some of the perfectionism tendencies occurring in your life.
I mean, I think for people that have, body image issues, and also just sort of disordered eating, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be an eating disorder, but just disordered eating, a disordered relationship with food. Yeah. Right. It's such an externalized thing, right? Because people really do notice how you look, right? If it's like, that's the ultimate window dressing, right? What do I look like? So, it's a very easy thing to sort of latch onto as like, this is going to be how I project myself to the world, right? It needs to look a certain way in order to be acceptable. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm curious what your thoughts would be on like how perfectionism impacts men versus women differently. And I think for sure that, when you think of perfectionism, perhaps the first thing you picture is a woman. And certainly I think there's so many external societal pressures that project perfectionism onto women. But I think that there's also probably a lot for men that go quite underappreciated or underlooked or overlooked is the word I'm looking for, that go overlooked for men as well. And I'm not sure if that's anything that you've had, any kind of like professional experience with any of your clients, or what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, I would say in general, women are more likely to internalize their in their emotional experience, women are more likely to internalize it than externalize it. So like internalizing would mean like they're taking out their, they're taking out their feelings essentially on themselves. So women are more likely to engage in cutting. Women are more likely to have eating disorders than men. I mean, I think also there's cultural expectations that are different for women than for men, especially around our bodies. Mm-hmm. But I think that, at the heart of it, really, like if anyone who's like striving so hard to sort of make it all seem so perfect, right? Like underlying that is a well of intense feelings, like of unprocessed feelings. And invariably there's some sense of like, some anger there, because when if you're thinking about someone, especially with regard to eating disorders and things, like people are taking that out on themselves, right? That's like there's a sense of self-loathing or self-criticism. Like that's aggression on oneself.
Yeah.
Right. So, there's all of this sort of like underlying unprocessed feelings that are always underneath it all. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you had any work with men related to this topic?
Not so much on perfectionism. I don't know that. I think that, no, not. I mean, I think that, men that I work with tend to be more likely to say that they're feeling like they're stuck or they're underperforming or, right. But they don't describe it in the same way.
Yeah. I would imagine still though, the fear of underperforming, of feeling like they need to reach the certain thing is a layer of perfectionism somewhere, but I could see where the language would be different for sure. Yeah. That would make sense.
Yeah. There's a different way of describing it, but I mean, right, exactly. It's like, what are the metrics of performance for men and what are the metrics of performance for women? There are cultural differences, gender differences there.
Yeah, definitely. And I know I kind of asked, a few minutes ago about how perfectionism has presented itself in your life. And, as I even reflect on my life a little bit, I think there's definitely been things, of being slightly an overachiever at times, even looking at, I did my bachelor's in 3 years and went straight to my master's and did that in 2 years and graduated very early and went to Hopkins and all these things to where academically I was like for sure succeeding. And, I've had moments where I look back on that and I'm like, okay, yeah, like what was my purpose in that? Like, what did that mean for me? And what did that, I think I'm curious. I'm going to share just a little story, and I'm curious to hear what maybe your experience was with this. Before applying or before going to Hopkins, my boyfriend at the time had gotten into the program, and we were living in Baltimore at the time. And so, anytime we were out somewhere and he told someone, he was going to Hopkins, the reaction from people was just absurd. It was like, oh my God, like good for you. Like the way that they looked at him completely changed when he said that he was going to Hopkins. And growing up, with a single mom, being the first person in my family to go to college, this part of me that still felt like I didn't belong in that kind of field or in that image, to me still felt like, okay, like, I don't know if I want that. Like, I don't want people to look at me like that. Like, that feels like a lot of pressure. Like, because people would joke, oh, well, you're going to cure cancer for us. And he's like, I'm in a counseling program. Right. And I got into Hopkins and I went back and forth with myself and had also got into the program at Loyola in Maryland and rejected Hopkins and accepted Loyola. And then, in my head, it was like, I don't need this like big name. Like Loyola is a really good program too. And I don't want to go to a school just because of the name of it and for that to like fill some kind of weird like validation when I tell people this. And went through all this stuff. And then eventually, right before the cutoff, had emailed Hopkins back and was like, actually, can I come? I was able to finish the program a lot quicker. What
made you, I'm so curious what made you switch?
Yeah,
your decision.
Well, first I knew I wanted to move back to Washington State and come back to Seattle, and the Loyola program would have taken me a lot longer. So the Hopkins program, I knew I could finish in 2 years, and the whole second year of the program was just your internship. So I was like, I can move back to Seattle and do that there. And then a large part of it too was just seeing my boyfriend in the program, and he really loved it and, you know, had really good mentors. And I just was like, yeah, you know, maybe it will be easier and, you know, to already have someone kind of there. And the Loyola program also was a little bit more research focused than the Hopkins program. The Hopkins program was a lot more like reflection based and counseling specific work. So that was for sure what I was more interested in at the time. So there were many reasons like why I changed back, but there was this like internal battle within myself of like, you know, my boyfriend at the time was like hella bougie, like grew up very, very privileged, very wealthy. You know, he, had money to spare, his family. And to me, it just felt like, you know, yeah, like I don't belong in a program like that, and didn't want the pressure of it. And I always go back and I look at it and I'm like, was that me like fighting perfectionism? Was that me just like trying to be humble, but then being like, nah, like I want that? I don't know. It's been a confusing thing to process. And I'm curious for you going to Harvard, like what that experience was. I imagine that's like even more amplified when you tell people you went to Harvard than when I say I went to Hopkins.
But what's so interesting to me is, and I think it's like, you know, interesting too to the audience, and you think of like listening to you tell your story. What's so fascinating, right, is like there's two issues here. One is, where are you going to get the best, most rigorous, most interesting, most, you know, challenging academic experience? Yeah. Okay. Like that's the real question.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And then there's all this other drama that has to do with like, well, if I go here, they're going to think this. And then if I go there, then I become this identity. And I don't want to be that identity, right? So it's really interesting to listen to the way that we described the decisions we make, because there's an intrinsically motivated direction, which is like, I'm going to make the choice given the constraints of my life. And like, you know, if you're like your partner lives somewhere, like that's a constraint, right? That you take into consideration. I want to be next in the same city as the person that I love and like my support network. Okay. Totally valid. But there's like, there is the intrinsically driven, you know, components or like factors in the decision. And then there's like all of this external drama, right? All the externally motivated reasons to either do it or not do it. Yeah. Right. So for someone, it's like, oh, I have to take Hopkins because Hopkins it's the most prestigious. And like, you know, everyone will think that that's so important and that will make me a better, more, you know, worthy human being. And so there's no question. Of course I'm going to take it. Or they could be like, no, if I go to Hopkins, that means I'm one of those people and I hate those people. Those people are like elitist and right. And privilege and this and that. And so all of the drama is all wrapped up in our terror, you know, right? That other people are going to have whatever other people's opinions are going to be about our choices. And when you think about those two different sort of like the intrinsic, you know, factors and the extrinsic, you know, externally driven factors, like the intrinsically driven factors are so straightforward, right? Which advisor is the best advisor? Which program is the better fit for me? Like, which one did I just have a better vibe at? Which one did I like better? Which one do I think is going to be a more like exhilarating academic experience for me versus like all of this, like, well, what if this happens? And what if they think this? And what, right? It's like, and so we spend so much time in the external drama. Yeah. And by the way, we've made it all up in our brain. It's like, have you, you know, like if you ever notice those people that are criticizing you or those people that are having an opinion about you, is it weird that their opinion sounds so much like your own thoughts? Yes. Right? It's like, because they're just your thoughts. You're just giving them an opinion in your brain. You're like, well, they're going to think this. Like, okay, that's because I've decided that that's what they're going to think. Right? You have no idea. But it's so interesting, like how we make this is where our life gets so messy.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine this is where a lot of people kind of get stuck. And that's part of what you do in your work is helping people kind of get unstuck. And I'm wondering, is it kind of within this realm of what we're talking about where people get stuck that you focus on?
Absolutely. I mean, I think for people that, I think whether you call it, perfectionism, it's sort of like there's like a certain standard. And if I don't hit that standard, or if I don't perform at a certain level, like I'm going to get found out for the worthless human that I am. Mm-hmm. Like, which is really at the heart of perfectionism. Like I'm terrified for people to see whatever you think the real me is, that is, so unacceptable to other people. Or whether it's just like being very externally oriented. So the decisions that you've made in your life were always about other people and other people's opinion, right?
Yeah.
Like what other people think about you, and you're making those choices
how would you say
based on that.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm curious what other people's expectations or thoughts or perceptions of you played a role in you going to Harvard.
Oh my God, totally. I was like, I'm like carrying the banner for externally oriented, like, please approve of me. Right. Like that was the ultimate for me of winning other people's approval. Right. And I think when people get really, what's difficult for people, right, is that that muscle of listening and actually checking in with themselves. Like, what do I think? What do I want? Yeah. What lights me up? What is interesting to me? They have so disconnected themselves from their own experience, their own internal experience, their feelings, what's going on in their body. Like their neck is so disconnected from, their neck is severed, right? The head is totally disconnected from the body, that it's like, it takes a real work to reconnect themselves, to make themselves whole in the sense of where they can begin to navigate their life, like self-author their life, where they can actually make decisions from a place of like, I'm going to do this because I want to, because it's what I feel called to do, or it's what I want, as opposed to like, oh yeah, I'm going to definitely go to that school because everyone will think it's the better choice, or everyone will think that I'm a better human if I do that. Right.
Yeah. And so then when you go and then you have that, stamp of, I went to Harvard, and people do then approve of that and put you in this certain light, then is that like, you've achieved it all? Like your perfectionism is gone now because you've gotten this external validation. Like I imagine, it doesn't stop. It's just to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing.
Yeah, you're on the treadmill to nowhere, right? Mm-hmm. There's never, ever, ever, ever enough validation. There's never enough accolades. There's never enough, praise, achievements that are going to accomplish the real goal, like the real issue, which is truly liking who you are.
Yeah. That's a scary one, I think, and that's a big one that takes a whole lot of energy and time and work. And I mean, I feel like I've said this in several episodes, but it's such a shame because we really don't actually get taught skills to be able to do that. We don't, grow up learning how to like ourselves or how to cope with our feelings and when difficult stuff happens. And I'm wondering for you, doing, being an expert in positive psychology and doing developmental work as well, kind of how like positive psychology can play a role in people learning some of these skills to get to a place of liking themselves. I mean, positive psychology is not a topic we've discussed on the podcast before. So if you could maybe help give our listeners like a little explanation on what that is,
right.
I think that'd be helpful.
A little primer on positive psychology.
Yes.
So positive psychology simply means that people that are in the field of positive psychology, we research the causes and correlates of happiness. So, what is correlated with people that self-report that they're, happy or have, well-being, and they score high on measures of well-being. What are the common denominators? What's going on there? And then also, like, can we understand what some of the perhaps causes of people that seem to be uniquely sort of like mentally healthy. We also look at optimal human functioning. So people who are very exceptionally talented or seem to be exceptionally resilient, and like looking at people that are sort of what's right with people, essentially, as opposed to studying what's wrong with people. So we study character strengths, virtues, as opposed to studying, like psychological dysfunction. We study psychological function.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is, by the way, super fun. It's really fun to try to like unpack and understand, why is this person, despite the things that have happened to them, or like, in a very stressful situation, like they seem to rise to the occasion. What's going on there? How does that happen? Mm-hmm. Right? How is, what is it that makes life worth living? Like, what are the experiences? What are the psychological experiences and the emotional experiences that make life worth living? Like, let's study that. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm wondering too, if you can kind of share and tell us a little bit about how people can use positive psychology in their own lives when they're coping with, let's say, just for example, here, since we've talked about it most of the episode, of dealing with perfectionism. Yeah.
Well, so there's been some really interesting studies, but I think one of the things that's really important to remember about positive psych is that it's not trying to, it's merely saying, hey, hold on a second, psychological community here. Like, we need to address the 0 point of okay. We need to address the human experience from 0 to positive 10. Because primarily, the field of psychology had been focused on and addressing the human experience of 0 to negative 10. Right?
Very true. Very true. Yeah.
So like depression, anxiety, personality disorders, addiction, right? Like the things that make when our lives sort of like when things fall apart. Right. And so when I think positive psychology was really sort of a response to this, to say, hey, there's a full spectrum of the human experience that's not just about mitigating and sort of healing disease and disorder and pathology, but it's also about helping people actualize into a more evolved, up-leveled, to like modern vernacular, but like up-leveling them and evolving themselves. Mm-hmm. So, I think there's been some really there's so much that we've learned in the last 20 years from the field of positive psych, but what makes life better? What makes relationships better? Like, how do we communicate with people better? Like all of this research that's emerged. But I think what's really important to remember is that like when you are working on yourself, like when you work on your strengths, you augment what you're already good at, you get better at what you're good at. And you use some of these more strength-oriented approaches, like instead of focusing on like what's not working in your life, like let's look at what is working on your life. How can we amplify that, right? Yeah. That simple switch, that little like minute shift in the way that you approach somebody and yourself and trying to change your life, that it's just more fun to focus on what's going right, right? It's just a lot more fun. And so people are more willing to stick with it, right? They're more willing to engage in the work because it feels better, frankly, right?
Yeah, I think it's tricky. I don't know, because like, yes, it is fun, but I think sometimes we also like have a tendency to focus on the negative. And I don't know, I'm sure there's like many reasons for that too, but I have seen even, you know, in my own work with clients where, you know, we'll talk, you know, especially for my clients that are like first, like new to therapy, like first time ever in any kind of counseling setting, of kind of having that little bit of reassurance that like, well, like what is good that's going on too. Like this isn't just a space to talk about, you know, the really difficult things, that it is also important to acknowledge the things that are going well. And I've actually, even this past week, one of my sessions was kind of focusing on the things that are working and the things that are going well, and why they're going well and what that feels like. Because I think oftentimes it can get super overlooked, and there starts to, you know, seep in this little bit of like shame sometimes for feeling good, that like, you know, oh, well, shouldn't I be like working even harder? And, you know, if I'm stressed out, that means I'm like being productive, and all these kind of weird external pressures that come in, that, you know, oftentimes I think the happiness parts are super fleeting, because they're also the most vulnerable to feel. And they then mean that we're risking a lot more by actually feeling that. And I think it's a place can be really, really scary and feel uneasy for people. Yeah,
I mean, I think that, our brains are definitely wired and biased towards negativity. It's just that negative emotions are, stronger and louder for good reason, right? If you're, it's helpful for survival to pay attention to a negative emotion, to fear, to anxiety. It's like, those are important to pay attention to, because they're going to keep you alive, right? Yep. So we are biologically wired to sort of hear and feel those emotions stronger. They just take up bigger space, even though most people have their ratio of positive to negative emotions. They feel more positive emotions, or, neutral to positive, than they do negative. And even clinically depressed people have a 2-to-1 ratio. So that's 2 positives to 1 negative.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like that, because the negative emotions are prioritized. Like our brain prioritizes the negative emotion. So there's really cool research that I love that Barbara Fredrickson did. And I think she's really revolutionized our understanding of sort of the evolutionary, basis of positive emotion. Like, why do we have them? What's their importance? And what she's really showed is that when there seems to be a tipping point at which positive emotions, our ratio of positive to negative emotions, where there's like a tipping point where positivity starts to beget more positivity, right? So there's this like, once you hit this 3-to-1 ratio, so you have 3 positives to 1 negative, once you hit that threshold, it seems to have sort of this like exponential upward spiral that starts to occur, right? Yeah. So, which is really fascinating. So just like water, ice turns to water. And if you think about ice as a negative emotion, like it's very rigid. It's this like cold, rigid, like tense. If you think about like the way the structure of ice, right? It's like hard to crack, hard to break. It's very brittle. And then when ice turns to water, and water being positive emotions, like more malleable, more flexible, more expansive, like flows, all of that, right? So when our, ice turns to water, just like at that, at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, there's this tipping point, right? Where ice melts to water. The same is true with our emotions. So at 3-to-1 ratio, there seems to be this kind of melting that occurs, where we begin to generate more and more positive things, because we have then more positive interaction. So it's like, it kind of breathes, it takes on a life of its own, right? Like we generate more positivity. So our experience of positive emotion and trying to cultivate on purpose, deliberately trying to cultivate more positive emotion is incredibly important.
Yeah, it almost reminds me a little bit of the 5-to-1 ratio that the Gottmans discuss for like healthy, happy, successful marriages. You know, for every like
their interactions.
Yeah, for every one piece of conflict or negative interaction, there's 5 positive interactions that help kind of counteract that. And when that ratio starts to get out of whack, and there's a lot more negative than there are positive, then we're more likely to be like obviously unhappy in our relationships. So. Yeah, no, I like that description of the ice cube, and I think that the ratio part's really helpful for that.
I think there's definitely a camp of people who are like, this is all just, who cares? Positive emotion. Like, it's so annoying. Everyone's got their like little positive meme on Instagram, right? Like, I get it. I can be cynical too. Yeah. But positive emotions, the reason that we have positive emotion is because they broaden our perspective. Like, we know this, there's so much research on that. It actually, when we are primed for positive emotion, our this phenomenon that we have called our own race bias. So we are biased to be able to distinguish faces of our own race better than we are people of other races. It's true for everybody, no matter what racial group you're in. And when you're primed for positive emotion, that bias dissolves. It's fascinating. So what happens is when people are primed to feel positive emotions, so they're like literally they're put in a lab, they watch like a cute puppy video, they feel like, oh, that was so cute. Then they're asked to look at a diverse range of faces on a piece of paper, right? They're just as good as distinguishing other races, like distinguishing facial features of other races as they are their own. So it's like, in some way, when we're primed to feel positive emotion, we broaden our perspective, meaning we see the forest and not the trees. So we see other people as humans, as opposed to like, she's white, she's Asian, she's a Black woman, right? Like, we don't see that. We see them as human.
Gotcha.
Super fascinating. Right. And when we're primed for negative emotion, it like amplifies our own race bias. It makes our own race bias stronger.
Interesting. I haven't like heard of or read that research. So that's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
It's super interesting. So it's like, you're being in a positive emotional, it's like being primed for positive emotion and staying and trying to cultivate more of that positive emotion in your life actually helps you feel more connected to the people around you. All around you. Like, really
that makes sense.
Yeah. And it makes you, there's tons of cool research on this, but it's like, it also broadens your perspective. It makes you more creative. You're a better problem solver. It also helps us build, right, connections and that sort of sense of oneness with people, right? So it helps us build communities and connections. So all of the amazing inventions and this incredible world that we've created, that was built on the foundation of positive emotion, right? Play, curiosity, interest, joy, love, awe, inspiration, all of those emotions. So, our from an evolutionary perspective, our positive emotions are absolutely essential.
Yeah, they're definitely very important, and I'm glad that that you've been able to give us this, detailed overview, which I guess is slightly contradictory to say detailed overview. But thank you.
A quick dose of some positive psych research. But yeah, there's so much cool stuff in the field of of understanding. Like, why does it matter that we're well? Like, why? Really? Why does it matter? It matters a lot. Why? Right? So that's what we're interested in understanding.
Yeah. And you've wrote on this like extensively in many different articles and many different outlets. There's one that I thought was really great on Bustle, about how to kind of hack your brain to be less negative, that I'll share in the episode notes. And we'll also share your website there. But if there's any other place people could find you to kind of follow more of your work or learn more about you, or if anyone wanted to reach out to you, where would be a good place that people could kind of find you and follow you at?
Yeah, so 2 places. Either find me on my website, and you can connect with me through like an application to work with me, or they're just like an email to send an email to, or on Instagram, which is just like my fun place to hang out and my musings and thoughts about a lot of them, things I'm working on myself, like we were laughing before we even got on recorded, but like I'm a human too. Like I am a human. We all have a condition. It's called being a human being and having a human brain. It's so tricky. Our brains are very complicated. And so there is nobody who's exempt from having to manage their mind, right? Like our minds are very squirrely and right. They're like little, like obstreperous children running around. Yeah. So we have to manage that. So everybody has to do this work.
Yeah. I always imagine it literally as like the little creatures in Inside Out when they're like all in the brain and they're like, totally. Like we're feeling this. And I'm like, that's my brain. Like literally.
It is. I love that. I love that movie so much. I was like, they had some really, really brilliant psychologists.
Yes. I feel like I need to go back and rewatch it.
It's really it's such a brilliant like illustration of sort of, all the different sort of voices and in our mind, which some of them, they're just little wounded parts of us, right? That are like, I just want to be heard. Absolutely. So, we all have to deal with this. There's no, you do not have to have a clinical problem to feel frustrated and like stymied by what goes on in your mind. Like this is just very normal human experience.
Yeah.
There really is a method and tools and skills that one can learn to feel better and have like a more, to really truly manage their mind and to have a better experience of life and to not feel like they're constantly dealing with, they're like, oh, here it is again. Like here I'm dealing with this again, right? There really are skills and tools that you can learn to evolve to the sort of the person you really want to be. Like you are the person you really want to be. And there are skills and tools that you can learn to sort of uncover that person.
That's beautiful. Thank you for saying that. I think that's super important. And thank you just for everything that you've said this episode. It's been super wonderful having you on, and appreciate, again, you just being human and sharing parts of your own personal life and in addition to your expertise and your knowledge.
Oh my gosh, thank you for what you're doing and all the amazing content you're putting out in the world. It's great.
Thanks. I'm really doing my best. I appreciate that. And thank all of you guys for making it through this whole episode. I hope that you learned some new things and that it was helpful, and definitely reach out if you're interested in learning some more. You guys can always reach me at ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm not always able to respond to all of the emails, but I do read them and I do super appreciate them. And if you guys have any like positive things to say about the show or just want to share something that you're liking or an episode that you loved, I would love to check that out in a review on iTunes. So if you have a minute and can head over to iTunes, and even just leaving a star rating really helps. But if you have, 30 seconds to write a sentence or two out, that would also be super wonderful. So thank you guys so much for listening and for your support on the show. And we'll be back next week to talk some more. So enjoy your week, and I'll talk to you guys next time.